He's a Victorian, so he tends to be very wordy. That's my opinion of the Victorians anyway, is they tend to say, to take 1,000 words to say what could be said in 200 by us. Yes, ma'am.
I like what he said about what action is basically doing for yourself, but in a good way. In a good way, it's already explained, but
Okay.
it's done for the common good, but at the same time, it's for yourself.
He's got this idea of how politics is all going to hold together, right? And how it's going to hold together is that each of us pursues our own good privately, and each of us leaves everybody else alone. And then the state comes in. How? What's the function for the state then? Or the government, or the coercive power of the collective? And clearly we have a government. He's not an anarchist. So we have a government, and I think some government powers are legitimate. There are some cases in which government can force me to do something and be correct in enforcing it. What was that? Let's take the key principle here, the object of this essay on page 9. What is his key point? His key principle. I'm trying to tell you, this essay is dedicated to proving a single principle. And what is it?
Entitled to government to meet the dealings of society.
Yeah. Right. That he's describing the principle. He's not telling us what it is. The next sentence he tells us what it is. What is that principle?
The sole aim for which mankind wanted individually
Okay. Rebecca, what more on that? Okay. Well, let's cash that out in terms of language that's more familiar to us. The sole principle entitled to govern, et cetera, et cetera. Self-protection I get at the end. But what is he telling us here? The only purpose for which power can rightfully be exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. That's the very next sentence. The harm principle, we'll call it that from now on. I've called it the liberty principle elsewhere, so if you see any of my Canvas pages or videos where I talk about the liberty principle, this is the same thing. The only justification for coercing anyone, what do we need to define that. Coercing, we want to get a clear idea of what he means by that. The only justification for coercing anyone is to prevent harm. Okay, we'll need to define that. And not just harm to oneself, not at all harm to oneself, but harm to others. And he goes right on to that in the very next sentence, right? His own good, either physical or moral, is not a sufficient warrant. He cannot be rightfully compelled to do or to forbear because it would be better for him to do so, or because it will make him happier, because in the opinions of others to do so would be wise or even right. He's breaking with exactly this politics of virtue, the idea that we know, or maybe the wise people among us know, what the good is for human beings because they understand human nature, and they then are able to apply that knowledge to push us in the direction that we ought to go. Let's define some of these words I said need definition. Coercion. What are we talking about when we talk about coercion? Right, so pause on that. First, justification. He's talking about when power, coercive power, is justified. So he's not giving us here a description of how the state does function. He's giving us here a prescription, a theory of how the state ought to function, of what state powers are legitimate. Okay, something to note here. He's giving us explicitly a moral argument here, an argument for a certain moral point of view regarding the power of the state. And that's important to notice, because what he's going to say is that a state which violates this harm principle is acting in an unjustified way, a way that we should condemn and attempt to reform. And he sees himself doing this in his own way in Victorian England. Coercion. What does that mean? We've read the 5 pages or so that I assigned for today. What is he talking about? It's really in that first sentence, Janae, that you started with. This principle, he says, is entitled to govern absolutely the dealings of society with the individual in the way of compulsion and control. I'm going to put that down here. When you attempt to control others, when you attempt to compel them, to force them to do something. These are all synonyms for coercion. Whether the means used be physical force in the form of legal penalties or the moral coercion of public opinion. What two things is he bringing in here? What shall I write? Coercion. He stipulates in that first sentence two types of coercion that he's talking about. What are they, Rebecca?
One-sided laws. Or is it just not accepted by others?
So he's talking both about legal pressure, and he mentions this as physical force. How is the law connected to physical force? Let's make sure that we understand precisely what he's talking about. Coercive power of the law, he says, is the power of physical force. How is that the case? No libertarians in the room? Yes, ma'am.
Like jail time?
Yeah, jail time. So whatever the law is, whatever is against the law is ultimately backed up by force. If you don't pay your taxes, what happens? They seize your property. If you don't surrender the property, eventually it comes to blows. Right? Somebody shows up at your house to evict you from it so it can be seized, or to seize this property from you. And if you fight back, then it comes to physical force. So prohibitions by law he connects with physical force. So we're not entitled to use physical force against other people except to prevent harm to others. And also public opinion. Call it social pressure, but what kind of social pressure does he think would be coercive on people? And what kind of things is he thinking of? Compulsion and control of society against the individual in the form of the moral coercion of public opinion. How do we coerce people using public opinion? They're individuals who are forced to do or say things differently from what they would do or say because of... Yes, ma'am?
They're to be judged and then you're ostracized.
Okay. We think of shunning or ostracism. I won't try to write ostracism. It's too long a word. Right? So an example would be shunning. Okay? It may not be against the law to tell racist jokes, but I certainly don't have to give you any sort of social credit. I certainly don't have to endure the presence of your company where it's voluntary for me. And in that case, the kind of person who does those sorts of things might be coerced into not doing them, at least not doing them quite so much. Okay, so the ways in which society kind of polices its boundaries through shunning or ostracism and the like, that fall short of him deploying the police to go arrest somebody and force him to do something or stop doing something. Right. I'm going to have to erase now. Any questions about what's on the board? We've gotten as far as coercion. So the only justification is giving, again, a moral category for applying either physical force or this kind of social pressure is going to be what? Prevention of harm to others. Why just others, do you think? Why would I not be justified in using the law or public opinion to stop somebody from doing something that only harms themselves? We can think of examples, I'm sure. Well, let's think of the examples, then we can talk about what Mill would say about them. What would be an example of an action I could take that would harm me without harming anyone else?
Drugs.
Drugs, okay.
Killing yourself.
Killing yourself, okay. Okay. Let me say taking drugs, right? That's what you meant. Who said drugs?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. His point is, if it only affects me and doesn't affect anyone else, doesn't harm anyone else, I should say, not just affect, but harm. If there's no harm to someone else, all the harm is to me, then there is no justification using either kind of coercion, political or moral, that is to say, the law, the police, or public opinion, to stop me from doing it. Lynn?
Not relevant anymore.
You sure?
Yep.
Okay. Suicide. Well, first off, let's take Mill's view. If suicide is a thing that only harms me, why am I not justified in using the state or public opinion to prevent it? What's his reasoning here? This was my second question, the bottom of page 9. The only part of conduct of anyone for which he is amenable to society, answerable to society, is that which concerns others. In the part which merely concerns himself, his independence is of right absolute over himself, over his own body and mind. The individual is sovereign. So I suppose we might say here, if we're talking about body and mind, I suppose getting a tattoo, some kind of body modification that only affects you, only harms you, or mind having certain beliefs, right, converting to a certain religion, at least as far as it involves belief, or refusing to believe in God. Okay, those are things that might come up. So first, why would a law against suicide be unjustified? For Mill, or why would a law against taking drugs be unjustified? Yes, ma'am.
Because you only yourself have something to over yourself. You're not affecting anyone else. And they're only supposed to protect those that you can harm. If you're only harming yourself. Saying that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is there a moral case for this? I guess I'm getting now to evaluating Mill's point of view. His suggestion here is that however much we might not like to see someone harm himself, if he's only harming himself, there's no justification for our intervening to stop him. Maybe we'll look at his arguments in just a few minutes for what those are. Further question before I get beyond this. Are either of these truly only self-harming? Or is there a way in which suicide harms other people? Yeah. So go ahead, Lee.
I think suicide harms everybody around.
Okay. Okay, how? Let's think about that without getting too upsetting. Who would be harmed by my suicide? I go home tonight and shoot myself.
Family.
Okay.
And those closest to you.
Okay, those people suffer. They also suffer financially, and there are repercussions for that. Other people have to find a way to support them. My wife has to find a way to pay off the mortgage. Probably my kid's schooling arrangement changes, or maybe you have to move. So I can say, well, look, there's harm to the others, so I'm actually going to take suicide off this list because that does harm other people, unless you are somebody with no attachments whatsoever. Do we let the guy with no attachments safely commit suicide, figuring nobody's harmed by it? I don't know, starting to get to sort of troubling area there. We'll pause on that. Taking drugs. No externalities for other people? Again, may depend upon maybe if you live a sort of isolated life where the only people that you associate with are your dealer and your fellow druggies. I'm sorry, go ahead, please.
You still harm your family then if that's the case. You lose like custody of your kids and it's illegal.
Okay.
Depending on what drug it is.
Sure. Well, actually, the whole question of whether it should be illegal or not is what's in play here. So we can't appeal to the illegality.
But it also helps your family because you don't end up taking care of your kids if you get addicted or your family.
Okay. So I say addiction. Certainly, if this leads to addiction, then the addiction has these negative externalities for other people besides you. Yeah.
I think it's that's a hard one because it's also good because I make money off of your demise. So.
Who's making money off of my demise?
Find your drug dealer.
If you're my drug dealer. So other people are benefiting from my taking drugs. So there actually is a sort of net positive, negative for some people, positive for other people. Okay. This guy's interested in keeping me alive and employed so I can keep funding him. Yeah, I don't know. This is getting kind of weird here, right? I'm wondering, my question is, if we take drugs off of this list and say this harms other people too, is there anything on this list? Things that harm only the self and don't harm anybody else? This is the sort of question. We'll carry this forward into the next class and the one after that, maybe also, yes.
Self-harm.
Self-harm, okay. Cutting yourself. In a sense, the problem here might be if there's anybody at all in the world who cares about you, those people feel the ripple effects of anything you do to you, even if you don't, right? So even if I despise myself, even if I think I'm just going to do this because what the hell I can, there are other people who care about me, and it seems that their care about me means that they're affected by what I do, even to myself. The question here, and we'll keep this open for a couple of days, is this just an empty category? There's just, maybe there is nothing really in this, or there's nothing significant in this. I mean, the things that you could do here for an ordinary human being are so unusual and rare that there's a sort of real harm to others. Now, we haven't defined harm yet. We need to come to that. Maybe there's some things here that would affect my family that wouldn't constitute harm to them in Mill's sense. So we'll have to back up and take a look at what he says there.
Yeah, I was going to say that because we're not talking about feelings. Like, I don't care if you're feeling it.
Okay.
Or like the thing like, now my situation is different. Now I have to get a new job, or I have to get stuff like that. And I guess that's hard, but like your feelings hurt because I got into
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so we need to really, maybe the thing to focus on here is we got the others versus self, and the idea that there's some things that involve only yourself and some things that involve others. He's got this idea that there's two types of actions that affect other people, and politics and public opinion can shape those, and then actions that affect only you. And he has a certain idea of what populates that second class of actions. And I'm suggesting, at least as a possibility, maybe some of the obvious candidates here maybe have some effect and some harm. So now we're arguing about what's in this category and then what the boundaries of this category are. But to do that, we need to talk about what he means by harm. There's a sidelight here for the second paragraph where he talks about children and barbarians, maybe also thinking of colonized peoples around the world. He's writing in the 1860s. What is his connection of this to the maturity of human faculties? Why doesn't this harm principle apply to our relationships with children or with, he thinks, lesser developed, more primitive peoples in the world? This sort of Victorian gentleman attitude towards humanity. Yes?
They don't have that right because someone's taking care of them.
Someone's taking care of them, but that's not going to be... It's almost like somebody's taking care of them because they don't have that right. There's something behind both of those things. They don't have the right, and someone's taking care of them. But what's the fact that is behind both of those things that explains both of those? We can take a look at what he says in the text, and we can sort of fill that in ourselves. I'm going to erase unless anybody has a question. You good? Why doesn't it apply to children? Why can I exercise coercive power over my children for their own good, not just because they're harming, not to prevent just harm to other people? Why can I force my kids, as I do frequently, to go to bed at the proper hour when they're the only ones who are harmed by their not going to bed until midnight? It would do if I let them. Lynn?
Wait, are you asking why we don't do that?
Yeah, why?
I thought we do though.
I'm sorry. Why? Right. Why am I allowed to do that according to Mill? Mill agrees. He says, yeah, you can coerce your children for their own good.
They're yours.
Not because they're mine. I mean, my slaves are mine if they were slaves. But there's something about children in particular. He says this applies. It need hardly be necessary to say that this doctrine is meant to apply only to human beings in the maturity of their faculties. Okay, what does he mean by that? I think we unlocked that in the paragraph. Yeah, Mia? Yeah. In what sense? Maturity of their faculties. Do we know what he means by faculties there? Yeah, what faculties do they lack in particular? Experience. What else? Yeah. Lack of knowledge, lack of experience. It's no better. I think what we're going for here really is reason. They lack reason and self-control and the ability to make decisions on their own behalf. Let's take a further look at that paragraph, right? We are not speaking of children or of young persons below the age which the law may fix as that of manhood or womanhood, Those who are still in a state to require being taken care of by others, that's what you were focusing on, Rebecca, must be protected against their own actions as well as against external injury. Why? Yeah, it could. I mean, if somebody's under the sort of legally compelled care of someone else, if I'm appointed the guardian of my parent who has Alzheimer's, nobody can apply the harm principle to my legitimate authority over him or her. But again, why? Why can I rule over people who lack reason for the sake of their own good? For the same reason, we leave out of consideration those backward states of society in which the race itself is in its nonage, its childhood. Let's take a look at the next sentence, top of page 10. I know we have 5 minutes left. The early difficulties in the way of spontaneous progress are so great that there's seldom any choice of means for overcoming them, and a ruler full of the spirit of improvement is warranted in the use of any expedients that will attain an end perhaps otherwise unattainable. Despotism is a legitimate mode of government in dealing with barbarians, provided the end of it is their improvement and the means is justified by actually affecting the end. Why is it? I'll give you my suggested answer. They cannot become free otherwise. People who lack this maturity and the ability to control themselves, to use their reason to make intelligent choices about whether and how to seek their own good, children, or, he says, barbarians, are not able to become free, so that leaving my children to make up their own minds about their bedtime and whether to study or not when they are, say, 9 years old, age of one of my kids, amounts to sacrificing their freedom, their long-term freedom. So when they reach the age of maturity, the age of adulthood, we have all these sort of legal standards, and he thinks these are entirely justified by the facts about the human race. Then we allow them to vote, we allow them to enlist in the military. And if you're 18, you can sign a multi-year commitment to the military that will be enforced against you with coercive power. Okay, just the fact that you sign that one piece of paper is going to affect what you're doing with your life for the next 4 years, even if you come to regret it sometime later. Okay, believe me, that's a power that you have when you're 18 that you don't have when you're 14. Okay, why? We assume that people, when they come to what's still called the age of reason, are liable for and responsible for the decisions and whether they're not prior to that. We give some reasons for this. We'll talk more about the direction of children as well. What are the 3 freedoms? Question 5. Page 11 to 12. I'll finish with this and we'll come back to it next class. Bottom of page 11. This then is the appropriate region of human liberty. This is where he thinks liberty applies to the individual life, the individual himself. It comprises first the inward domain of consciousness, demanding liberty of conscience in the most comprehensive sense, liberty of thought and feeling, absolute freedom of opinion and sentiment on all subjects. Freedom of opinion, he thinks, is implied by this system. Anybody's free to believe anything that they want, again, without the coercive power of the police or public opinion, forcing them. The liberty of express, okay, leave aside liberty of the press. Secondly, top page 12, this principle requires liberty of tastes and pursuits, of framing the plan of our life to suit our own character. Freedom of life plan, freedom to choose your own path, even if it is eccentric and out of the norm. And then lastly, thirdly, top page 12 again, from this liberty of each individual follows the liberty within the same limits of combination with other individuals, freedom to unite for any purpose not involving harm to others. But how shall I summarize that? Right? Don't kill people, but he's talking about something else here. There's a freedom that he thinks is also implicit in this harm principle. Freedom of, what do you mean a combination with others? First Amendment law? Freedom of association. Free individuals can come together with other free individuals for any purpose whatsoever that doesn't involve actually harming other people. So if I want to form a private militia and go kill people, that's not going to be allowed. But if I want to form a sort of eccentric religious cult devoted to the worship of me, you can find people who will voluntarily join it. You're welcome to do so. We'll pick up from this point and get into the next reading from Mill next time. Thank you guys for your patience with the technology. Hopefully we'll have it fixed soon. Thanks.